Well, it is a tragedy that continues to fascinate after more than a century. The Titanic hitting an iceberg and sinking in April 1912.
The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 remains one of history's most tragic maritime disasters. Over 1,500 souls were lost in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, leaving behind untold stories of heroism and horror. But what happened to the victims after the ship went down is a story rarely told in full. Not even the movies can picture it perfectly. It's far more grim than most imagine. From the freezing waters to burial at sea, the aftermath was haunting. Immediate aftermath: the cold North Atlantic. When the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, the night sky over the North Atlantic was eerily quiet, except for the cries of passengers in the water. The ocean temperature was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius, so cold that anyone who fell in would almost immediately begin to lose feeling in their fingers, toes, and limbs. Within minutes, hypothermia would set in, making it impossible to swim or even stay afloat. Many passengers who had been moments ago laughing, talking, or helping others were suddenly struggling to survive against the freezing water. Those who managed to cling to pieces of wreckage or debris found only temporary relief. The waves were rough, and the dark made it nearly impossible to see where others were. Lifeboats floated nearby, but there were not enough for everyone, and many were only partially filled. Survivors later recalled the horrifying scene of people screaming, clinging to each other, or slipping under the water, their hands reaching out for someone, anyone, to help. The cold made it impossible for most to fight for long. Some bodies sank immediately, trapped by clothing or the sheer weight of cold-soaked garments. Others drifted alone, carried away from the ship by the ocean currents. The blackness and the icy water combined to hide many victims from view, leaving the wreck site surrounded by floating debris and scattered frozen bodies. In that first hour after the ship went down, it became clear that many would never be seen again. For the survivors, the terror of that night did not end when they reached lifeboats. Many witnessed people they knew, or strangers they had just met, disappearing silently into the water. The sound of voices fading into the distance left lasting trauma, and the memory of helplessness haunted those who lived. The ocean, cold and merciless, had claimed far more lives than anyone could have imagined. Even after the initial sinking, the reality of the tragedy was clear. Most victims were gone forever, carried down to the depths, while those left floating clung to life with whatever they could find. The chaos, the cold, and the despair of that night set the stage for the grim recovery efforts that would follow. The sea had become a mass grave, and there was no turning back.
That boat sank. Why do you care about it now? I guess I wanted to know what caused certain people to survive and others to lose their lives.
With so many lives lost in the freezing waters, the next grim task fell to the recovery ships sent to the area, tasked with finding and identifying the victims. The first rescue effort. In the days following the Titanic disaster, several ships were sent to the site to recover bodies. The first and most well-known was the cable ship Mackay Bennett, based in Halifax, Canada. Its crew faced the grim task of searching the icy waters for bodies, many of which were scattered over miles. The cold, dark ocean had already claimed most of the victims, and only a fraction could be recovered. When the Mackay Bennett arrived, the crew found the water littered with debris, clothing, and, tragically, bodies. Some floated freely, while others clung to wreckage or lifeboats. Each discovery was a challenge. Many corpses were frozen solid, making them difficult to handle, and some were badly decomposed. The ship's crew worked tirelessly, often in freezing conditions, to bring victims aboard. They wrapped the bodies in canvas and, when possible, used embalming fluids to slow decomposition during the journey back to Halifax. In total, the Mackay-Bennett recovered about 190 bodies. Other ships, including the Minia, Montmagny, and Algerine, were later sent to continue the recovery. Together, these ships brought back more than 300 bodies. Each one had to be carefully identified. For many, personal effects, clothing, or physical features were the only clues. When identification was impossible, the bodies were recorded as unknowns, and decisions had to be made about how to honor them. Not every body could be brought back to land. Some were too damaged, and some crews were forced to make heartbreaking choices. Those victims who could not be preserved or identified were buried at sea. Canvas wrappings and weighted stones were used to lower them into the cold ocean, a practical but sorrowful solution. The recovery crews described the emotional toll of this work. Handling frozen, broken, or unrecognizable bodies left many shaken. These efforts, though grim, were essential. They provided some closure for families and allowed victims to receive proper burials when possible. The scale of the tragedy, however, meant that the majority of Titanic's passengers remained lost at sea. For those recovered, the journey back to Halifax marked the first step in honoring the lives that had been tragically cut short. The work of these ships highlighted the human cost of the disaster, but also the determination to remember the victims. What followed next was another difficult stage, deciding who would be buried at sea and who would rest on land. For the bodies that could not be brought home, burial at sea became a heartbreaking necessity, while the rest were transported to Halifax for proper graves. Burial at sea and the transport to Halifax. For many of the Titanic victims, the nightmare did not end with the sinking. When the recovery ships found bodies too damaged, decomposed, or unidentifiable to transport, there was only one option left: burial at sea. The idea of lowering a human life into the cold, dark Atlantic was already heartbreaking. But for the crews, it was unimaginable work they had to face over and over. Canvas wrappings were used to cover the bodies, weighted stones tied to them so they would sink. And then they were released into the icy depths. The waves swallowed them immediately, leaving no trace. The sight was haunting. Crew members described the endless line of wrapped bodies being lowered over the side, each one a silent story of a life cut short. Some had been clinging to debris, others had simply floated alone, far from any help. Each burial at sea was a reminder that most of the victims would never have a grave on land, never have a name whispered in prayer on familiar soil. The sheer number of bodies, too many to count, made it a nightmarish task for the recovery teams. For the bodies that could be preserved, a more careful process awaited. Ships like the Mackay-Bennett transported them back to Halifax, Canada, the nearest major port. There, over 200 victims were given proper burials. Some were identified by clothing, personal effects, or physical features, while others remained unknown, recorded only as body number 123 or similar designations.
We're in the cemetery where they're buried.
So this is the start of the Titanic graveyards, and you'll see some that are just numbers because they are unidentified people.
Cemeteries in Halifax became the final resting place for these victims, with rows of gravestones marking lives lost far from home. Families who could not recover their loved ones were offered the comfort of knowing they rested somewhere, even if not beside family or friends. The contrast between burial at sea and land burial was staggering. Some victims vanished instantly into the Atlantic, never to be seen again. Others were carefully placed in coffins and graves, a fleeting attempt to restore dignity after unimaginable tragedy. The human toll of that night was incomprehensible. Over 1,500 lives lost, many never recovered, many remembered only by scattered belongings or whispered stories. Even decades later, Imagining those dark waters, littered with floating bodies, some buried at sea, some never found, is almost impossible. The Titanic's victims were swallowed by a merciless ocean, but those brought to Halifax stand as a haunting reminder. The scale of the tragedy was beyond comprehension, and the recovery efforts, though heroic, could never erase the horror. Yet for the majority of victims who were never recovered, the ocean itself became a final grave, a chilling reality that has left its mark on history forever. Decomposition, the sea, and cultural legacy. For the majority of Titanic victims, the ocean became the final resting place. Bodies that were never recovered sank to the bottom of the North Atlantic, hidden in the darkness, cold, slowing decomposition, but offering no mercy. The freezing water preserved some for a short time, yet for most, the sea was relentless. Many were carried away by currents, torn apart by waves, or consumed by marine life. The unimaginable scale of loss left no room for closure for families. Only grief and unanswered questions. Even decades later, imagining the deep, dark waters where thousands vanished is almost impossible. The ocean, vast and merciless, swallowed lives, belongings, and stories. What the recovery ships could bring back, just over 300 bodies, was only a fraction of the total. The rest were left in the icy depths, where pressure, cold, and currents would forever hide them from human eyes. Some victims may even rest near the Titanic wreck itself, entombed by mud and metal, a silent, grim memorial to lives lost in an instant.
The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous and tragic stories of all time. But how she met her fate was not just the result of a collision between a liner and an iceberg.
The tragedy of the Titanic did not end in the water. It forever changed maritime practices and culture. International law was revised, lifeboat regulations were strengthened, and safety protocols became more stringent. The disaster reminded the world that even the mightiest ship could not resist nature's force, and that human lives required more than optimism, they required preparation. Artifacts recovered from the wreckage, from clothing to personal effects, tell stories of the people lost. Each item serves as a haunting reminder of the lives cut short and the unimaginable circumstances they endured. Museums, memorials, and cemeteries in Halifax continue to honor them, allowing the world to confront the scale of the tragedy and reflect on the human cost. The Titanic's victims, whether buried at sea or resting in Halifax, remind us of nature's power and humanity's fragility. The waters that claimed them are silent yet full of history, a grave unlike any other. Imagining the icy black Atlantic, filled with drifting bodies and lost dreams, is chilling beyond words. It forces us to confront a reality that is almost too terrible to imagine, that in a single night, thousands of lives were swallowed by an unforgiving sea, leaving only fragments of memory, floating debris, and the haunting story of the Titanic. Even decades after the disaster, the Titanic's secrets continued to draw explorers and recovery missions to the cold depths of the Atlantic. Recovery missions and modern explorations. Even after the first recovery ship had completed its grim work, the tragedy of the Titanic was far from over. Additional vessels were dispatched to the North Atlantic in the weeks following the disaster, tasked with recovering bodies that the first ship could not reach. These missions faced the same harsh conditions: icy waters, scattered debris, and the overwhelming reality that most victims would never be found. The ships sent, such as the Minia, Montmagny, and Algerine, sought to bring closure where they could. retrieving floating or partially submerged bodies and personal items left in the wake of the sinking.
Underwater expedition to the wreck of the Titanic, and they show the ship's iconic bow has now fallen off after 112 years.
The work was painstaking and emotionally draining. Each recovered body told a story, often silent but heartrending. Some were still clinging to wreckage or pieces of the lifeboats. Others had been carried far by ocean currents. Many were too decomposed or damaged to be transported safely, leaving crews with the tragic task of burial at sea. Canvas wrappings and weighted stones became temporary guardians as these victims were lowered into the unforgiving ocean. The sheer number of burials at sea was staggering, and crew members later recounted the emotional toll, lowering dozens of bodies, one after another, into the cold darkness, knowing that most would never have a grave on land. Despite these efforts, the majority of Titanic victims remained lost to the deep. For decades, their fate was confined to memory and the scattered debris that drifted across the Atlantic. Families could only hope, and the ocean held its secrets tightly. Yet the story of the Titanic did not end with these early missions. Modern technology eventually allowed the lost to be studied in new ways. In 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard and his team discovered the wreck of the Titanic roughly 12,500 feet below the ocean surface. Using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, they were able to map the site in detail and capture images of the ship's remains and the surrounding debris field. While no bodies were recovered in these modern missions, the cold, deep waters had long claimed them. The expeditions revealed the haunting reality of where many victims ultimately came to rest, scattered across the sea floor, entombed in mud, metal, and the silent ocean. Since then, numerous expeditions have returned to the wreck site. Some have focused on archaeological mapping and preservation, others on artifact recovery, bringing up dishes, clothing, personal items, and pieces of the ship itself. Each artifact recovered carries with it a story, a human connection to the tragedy of 1912. Modern explorers often describe an eerie quiet surrounding the wreck, a stark contrast to the chaos of that night. Yet, it is in that silence that the horror of the disaster is felt most deeply. The continued recovery missions and modern explorations together form a bridge between history and memory. The early post-disaster recoveries brought back tangible evidence of lives lost, offering some closure. Modern expeditions have allowed humanity to witness, study, and reflect on the Titanic and its victims, ensuring that even in the depths of the ocean, the story and the haunting legacy endures. Though technology provides insight, the Atlantic keeps most of its dead hidden, a chilling reminder of the tragedy's scale and the unforgiving power of the sea. Now that we've looked at the tragic story and recovery efforts, let's take a moment to remember the lives lost on the Titanic. These people always deserve to be remembered, even honored, both the named and the identified. In memory of the Titanic victims. In the vast tragedy of Titanic's sinking, many victims remain nameless, lost to the sea, swallowed by the cold Atlantic, never recovered. But among the more than 1,500 lives lost, there are those whose names, faces, and stories survive. People with families, hopes, and dreams. Their loss helps us grasp not only the scale of the disaster, but the human cost behind each number. One of the most remembered is Isidor Straus, a successful businessman and co-owner of the famed department store Macy's. Beside him was Ida Straus, his wife of many years, a devoted couple who, as the ship sank, chose to remain together. When offered a lifeboat seat, Isidor reportedly declined, while there were still women and children waiting. Ida refused to leave him, Eyewitnesses said they were last seen on deck, arm in arm, accepting their fate together. Isidore's body was recovered and eventually laid to rest in a mausoleum in New York. Ida's body was never found. Their story of love, loyalty, and tragic loss stands out among the many tales of that night.
Among those overlooked was a man named Joseph LaRoche, the only known black passenger aboard the Titanic. It wasn't until the 1990s that his story was finally brought to light by his daughter.
Then there was Joseph Philippe Lemercier LaRoche, a young engineer born in Haiti. He boarded the Titanic along with his pregnant wife and 2 daughters, ordinary people hoping perhaps for a better future. When the disaster struck, he made the heartbreaking choice of placing his family into a lifeboat. His wife and daughters survived, but he did not. His death transformed the journey of a hopeful immigrant family into a story of profound loss. Though many of Titanic's victims came from wealth and privilege, LaRoche's story highlights how the catastrophe cut across race, nationality, and social class, touching ordinary families and emigrants alike. The tragedy also struck the very young. Among those brought ashore in the aftermath was the tiny body of a child, for decades known only as the unknown child. His grave in what is now Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax became a symbol of all children lost on that night. Years later, he was identified as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old boy whose entire family perished. The story of Sidney is especially heartbreaking because it reminds us that for some, the tragedy wasn't just personal loss, but the erasure of an entire young life and a family line. But the victims were not only wealthy businessmen, immigrant families, or infants. They included ordinary working people, men, women, children from many walks of life. Many aboard Titanic were immigrants seeking a new start. Some were middle-class professionals, others humble laborers. Their hopes, plans, and dreams died with the ship. For those whose bodies were identified and returned to land, there was a small measure of closure. But for countless others, families were left with nothing but grief and uncertainty. The graves in Halifax and other cemeteries, the headstones marked with names and those unmarked, act now as a silent memorial to the magnitude of the loss. Each marker stands for a person, someone's spouse, child, parent, or friend. For relatives who survived, children left orphaned, spouses left widowed, parents left childless, the disaster was not a news story, but a lifelong wound. In remembering these identified individuals, we embrace their humanity, their backgrounds, their relationships, their unrealized futures. In doing so, we honor the victims not just as a collective tragedy, but as real people, people who laughed, loved, hoped, and left behind families who would forever wonder what might have been. And perhaps most importantly, their stories remind us that the victims were not a statistic. They were lives, varied, ordinary, and extraordinary, each with a name, a family, and a history. In remembering them, we acknowledge the true weight of the disaster. The story of the Titanic and its victims still fascinates and moves us today. Subscribe to this channel to see more amazing history stories.